There's hardly anything more American than a solid pie to cap off the week. If we could swap every star on the flag with mini pies, you bet we would. And no one, absolutely no one, crafted a better pie than Grandma. So let's take a look at some of her best traditional recipes. The thing about a good is a classic chess pie is you can never go wrong with it. People would use to pass around phrases like "it's just pie," with just changing to chess as both the board game and fish got a bit more popular than they started out as. A chess pie makes use of some pretty day-to-day ingredients, so you don't really need to think too much here. Just put your mitts on and let's get baking. You might be wondering what this dish really has to do with chess, though. And well, the honest answer is nothing. There isn't a real explanation for why the chess moniker stuck to it. But one theory was that when people in medieval England used to ask about what kind of pie this was, bakers would typically respond by saying it was just pie. You know how words got distorted over time? I mean, just look at Gen Z. Eventually, the same thing happened, and this became known as chess pie. It was one of the first things to really make a lot of use of cornmeal, vinegar, and lemon juice, so if we talk about chess, this dish was played 5 steps ahead of the game. These were ingredients that would make up the majority of pie making in a lot of countries, not just America. A lemon icebox pie is one of those widely considered lucky breaks in American history. It actually is a symbol of some outdated technology because it was from the era that came before modern refrigeration. Back then, people had to use these containers filled with ice to keep things chilled and preserve the flavor. This was really true in the South, where the heat often meant that desserts were often enjoyed warm too. This was pretty true for most kinds of lemon pies. People just thought if you were having one, it was probably going to be a warm one, but nothing really beats a cool pie, you know? There's something about that which takes the edge off of a hard week. Icebox pies in general were the answer to that desperate want before modern fridges made life monumentally easier for everyone else. They built all pies around the icebox too because these pies were baked in a way which let them firm up while they were sitting in the icebox. Anyway, back to the lemon pie, which we aren't exactly too sure about who created it. But we do know it was the star of any summer one spent in the South. Especially in the 1920s and 30s, where lemons were one of the few precious things that inflation hadn't robbed from the people. Banana cream pies are exactly as good as you would think they are, and they make use of the freshest banana fruit available. Cream pie seems like something that's always been associated with American culture, but in all actuality, it only became that way during the late 19th and 20th century, when increased imports meant that America started getting a heftier supply of pies. The banana cream filling the pie made use of popular ingredients like vanilla, bananas, fresh cream, ingredients everyone not only had at home, but loved a lot. So really, it is no wonder why banana cream pies became a household special that grandmothers would often make whenever family was over. The real wonder is why the pie went out of fashion. I mean, all the ingredients are perfect and the taste is impeccable, so why lose a treasured pie? Even the armed forces agree with how great the pie is because in 1951, banana cream pie was named their favorite dessert on duty. As time went by, though, this delight got replaced by the formidable banoffee pie and lost its charm amongst the masses. Now, speaking of fruits, America's never really been one for berries unless we talk about cranberries, which is why you may not be used to hearing about Blackberry Pie and how it takes a flaky double crust and creates an incredibly refreshing blackberry filling. It first got into the American mainstream because of old recipes of Native Americans using blackberries much before the colonial days. It's a sweet summer classic like nothing else. The history of blackberry pies actually ends up going all the way back to the European settler period where America wasn't really established as a country yet. It got known for a few things: how simple it was because it took like 3 ingredients, how it used cobbler and blackberries together in the pie filling, and how it was one of the first pies to start using double crusts instead of the normal single flaky ones. It was something that became a huge part of picnic culture in the Midwest. And this pie is still a nostalgic memory of better and younger days for people who remember it. Wilma Tidwell is one popular name in cooking circles in America if you keep an ear out and know who she is. She was famous for a lot of recipes, and the iconic chocolate chip pie is no exception. She's the reason this dish has its style and substance, which separates it from just any other old chocolate chip dish. It was really popular at all kinds of potlucks. People who would organize big family events and wanted to save costs by catering themselves would make a lot of use of Wilma Tidwell's legendary recipes. Have you ever heard of word-of-mouth promotion? The next time someone at your workplace or during a heated online argument brings up whether or not it works, you can give this pie as an example. Its popularity was entirely, and I mean completely, sustained by word of mouth. People wouldn't ever stop talking about it, and I mean, sure, the initial news of the pie may have gotten around better thanks to community cookbooks, but it took one person to read about it, and by the next day, 10 others in the neighborhood knew about it, and 5 were trying to get the recipe down. This pie was really special to Americans because chocolate chip cookies were already a massive thing in every corner of American life. Stopping for a quick sandwich at Subway? Why not grab a chocolate chip cookie on your way out? Got a date? Nothing better than some chocolate chip goodness. Need to feel better with some sugar binging? You know what to do. So it wasn't really just the South that loved this pie. It was everywhere. If you look at a lot of the food in the South, you'll find the impact of buttermilk everywhere. Southern buttermilk pie is no real exception. It was a family classic that many home chefs perfected over the span of their time as a chef. It was typically kept only for holidays, gatherings, and celebrations, but over time it even became popular as a casual dish that families would prepare when it had been a while since they last saw each other. Did you ever know how buttermilk got so popular as a pie ingredient, though? It's actually because of butter making in general. The milk was literally just a side effect of the process, but farmers thought it could turn a neat little profit if they started selling that too. They didn't know they'd be handing the keys to an entirely new kingdom of culinary mysteries to people when they first did it. Since then, people have added all kinds of things to buttermilk pies to get newer flavors out of it. Vanilla extracts, lemon zest, berries, maple syrup, you name it. A buttermilk pie out there is probably based around it. Mississippi mud pie has a funny story to its name. If you haven't grown up around the banks of the Mississippi River, then you wouldn't know it or be able to catch it either. The banks of that river are known for their extremely dark muddy color, more so than any other river, and the reason we call it this is because the mud pie resembles exactly the same shade. It's probably in the 20th century during the post-World War II era where this dish really took off. The first versions I could find talk a lot about just being a simple chocolate filling and a crust, like a pretty dense and thick fudge cake, but later ones even use marshmallows and ice cream. They also have a newfound focus on different chocolate layers, which give the pie entirely new levels of depth as a dish. You can use pretty much any kind of chocolate you'd like, as the whole point of this dish is to dump as much of that as possible into one pie. Gooseberry pie just isn't something you would see anymore these days. It's not that the taste faded out or there isn't an audience for that kind of flavor anymore. There definitely is. It was widely enjoyed throughout America, especially in rural places with strong ties to agriculture. The tart was made of these perfect gooseberries and just had one thickener, all being baked into a fluffy crust. It was a very early 19th century recipe, and you honestly just had to be there for when this was in its heyday. If you went to some corners in New England that are really into retro cooking, you would still find a lot of love for this dish, also because we just don't have enough gooseberry representation in American cooking in general. It's a shame it went out on its last legs in the early 20th centuries, because summers back then weren't even a quarter as bad as they are today. Seriously, why did they get all the summer recipes when we're the ones facing heat strokes every June and July? Similarly, grapefruit pie is an even lesser-known delicacy in America than blackberry pie. It's just that dishes which made a lot of use of actual natural ingredients instead of processed stuff and layers of thick whipped cream faded out of the general food scene. You don't hear too much about them anymore, even though they're probably a lot simpler and easier to make. That's how they got their name in times where modern conveniences just weren't there, you know? It's things like that which make them timeless and something you can enjoy anytime. I guess this isn't an all-natural dish, though. since it does make use of gelatin, which started getting popular in the 1950s and 60s onwards. Sour cream pie is a lesser-known but really beloved American dessert, which goes all the way back to European immigrant communities, especially the ones from Eastern Europe. The best part of this dish is that it takes something like sour cream and actually makes a proper dessert out of it. It was first only something that would come out of German kitchens, and it had very little American influence. Sour cream in America, on the other hand, was largely just used in casseroles and such, maybe the occasional cake or tart. When these immigrant populations first came and made their homes in the Midwest, flourishing Eastern European communities in America meant that the country was getting an expanded, more global food palette. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, anywhere you'd go in states like these, you would get sour cream pie. Some of it was plain, as in just a custard made with sour cream and sugar, but some of it was based around fruits like apples and raisins. Dishes like these are just the best, don't you agree? I really prefer raisins to apples, but you might be the opposite. The dish is built in a way that it could work for the both of us, and that's why most homes adopted the sour cream pie and stuck to it religiously in times of need. Sometimes a calm, non-volatile dish that can be spun a few different ways depending on basic stuff really helps. Eat. Are you a fan of the fall, the weather, the orange leaves, the scenery, and most importantly, the amazing food? One of the best examples of food you'd find everywhere during fall was plum pie. People would make it to get through the summer and enjoy the start of fall, and it was why a lot of fruit orchards were in business. They still are, you just see a lot less of them because everything can be bought in a store in a can now. Back then, it was still common to go to fruit orchards and get your produce right there. Plum in general was something that never stuck for kids, but mostly for the older middle-aged audience with a more refined taste. Fig pie is kind of the same, except it's not really a pie that you would have found in America before the country decided to venture on a culinary quest to find out new flavors from abroad. Fig pie really took off when Spanish immigrants brought it over in the 18th century, but after that, it faded into irrelevance until the 1960s and 70s. Maybe it took that long for the taste of fig to come back into rotation for Americans? Either way, there were a few states that really didn't play about their fig pie, like Louisiana or Mississippi. There, you'd always get an amazing fig pie no matter the time of the year. This was especially true if you were a part of your local church communities. Back then, churches still used to host potlucks really regularly, and one of the most common dishes at these potlucks would be a sweet fig pie. You would even have dried fig pie because dried figs had a much thicker filling. Some people in Georgia would enjoy white fig pies instead of the normal ones, but when a dish has 5 different versions and church support, you know it's been popping off with everyone. Some of the 2000s versions of fig pies use goat cheese and balsamic reduction, but if you want a purely 1920s variant with all its authenticity, then the simpler you go with the ingredients, the better. Nectarine pie is probably something you aren't used to hearing either. Nectarines themselves are believed to be nature's offshoot of peaches, and the pie also evolved alongside peach pie, which is kind of poetic, I'm not gonna lie. In terms of flavor, you can kind of expect it to taste like peach pie, but not fully. This one's more acidic, and it has a way heavier taste. It's also made with a thickener in a flaky, heavy crust, so it's not exactly a light or airy dessert. The filling is made out of maple syrup and nothing else, and in places like New Hampshire, it's even a festival dish that people make to celebrate the maple harvest. Honestly, no one knows where nectarine pie really came from, but I can tell you that agricultural-based cooking, which made use of natural harvests and fruits that were native to the land, was something extremely common in the South. A lot of these dishes have deep ties to the South because there was a still strong tradition of farming and harvesting in the area, unlike the major metropolitan ones like New York and Washington, where street food and deli culture was more popular. Anyway, fresh nectarines were one hell of a natural thickener, but people would still add cornstarch on top for an even firmer pie. It's said that this dish is the pride of the South, and a lot of people actually preferred it to a typical peach pie since it was a fresh taste but also familiar. Since maple harvests are the topic, let's talk about the best thing to ever come out of them, which is maple syrup pie. It was something that people only associated with Canada, but now you'd find it in bulks and batches throughout bakeries in the US too, especially if you go to the northeastern areas. The reason this became so popular is because it took 5 ingredients max, the maple syrup, and then your typical assortment of stuff you need for a pie: cornstarch, flour, butter, and eggs. The maple syrup pie became extremely common in places like Vermont. Maple syrup in general is something that people always associate with the holiday seasons here. There's an extreme amount of maple syrup sales that you can credit solely to the large amounts people tend to buy during the Thanksgiving to Christmas stretch of the year. People tend to go all out on syrups and desserts during that time, since they like having something other than cranberry sauce to serve to the guests. It's also something that rises once fall hits because a lot of people feel like maple syrup matches the warm, slow, and cozy spirit of the season. If you go on over to states like Vermont, though, you'll find that the most common thing there was actually something called black bottom pie. This takes a graham cracker, a pastry crust, and a melted chocolate layer with a custard and whipped cream to give you one very heavy pie. It's known for its several layers of flair. First, you have your shaved chocolate and pecan toppings, then the custard, then the crust itself, before you get to the filling deep inside, which just oozes out once you get to the bottom of the pie. Some people used to call this a yin-yang pie because the base was pretty dark, but the topping was really light, hence why it got the name Black Bottom Pie. It took bakers and Nestle chocolate to make, so home cooks found it really easy to get the core ingredients for this recipe going. Plus, it was like most cream pies of its time, in the sense that it had a custard or a thick pudding base that was then used as the filling for a pre-baked pie shell. This dish was one of the first signs of a big focus on aesthetic and presentation, which wasn't really a thing in the early 20th century. People wanted their food to look good, but they didn't really care about making a show of it or having any coordinated design themes. This dish went in the opposite direction, though, which made it really appealing for a lot of people to both look at and eat. Sliced sweet potato pie was often served with molasses, which got extremely common in the States as a whole during the World Wars and how they introduced rationing as a national concept. People got by on sweet potatoes and molasses rather exclusively, actually. It became one of those Southern recipes that just always gets handed down from one cook to another, and it was the talk of the town for ages. People loved to come into states in the South for a good sweet potato pie, especially during Thanksgiving. The sweet potato pie itself is actually something we can thank African American cooking for, because they were the ones who saw the natural sweetness of it and thought it would make for one delicious pie. It was also something you'd find in spades if you went through potatoes that were very native there. A neighborhood with a large African American presence. The sliced version came as a result of a focus on presentation, which again was in its baby stages as a concept. This was really popular in Central and South America because sweet potatoes were very native there. As far as the presentation went, they'd often cut the pie up into wedges and serve it that way instead of slices, which kind of made you feel like you were eating sweet potato. Oatmeal caramel cream pies are something special. They weren't too common or as memorable as some of these other dishes. In fact, you probably haven't even heard of one until this video. But I'm going to show you why they got so beloved in the niche community they made for themselves. First, you have to ask, how did the idea of mixing oatmeal and caramel into a cream pie come into place? It began with the creation of the oatmeal cookie, which had already become widely available in America by the 19th century. Oat consumption in general was much higher in those times than it is today. While we might eat oatmeal for its value as a protein, people ate it back then because of the fiber and how it kept you full for really long. Anyway, the very first American oatmeal cookie recipes started in the 1800s. Then came Little Debbie, which was owned by McKee Foods, and in 1960 they introduced the oatmeal cream pie. It had soft oatmeal cookies stuffed into a sweet cream filling, and when that got old, they decided to take everything up a notch with the addition of caramel. Now it has 2 cream fillings. One was oatmeal and the other was caramel, and this was easy enough of a dish that you could get busy in the kitchen and even make it yourself. It may have been a little complicated getting the mixture of cream and caramel just right, but with enough practice, it was easy. This dish had the power to appease a group filled with people from all age groups, so it's definitely something grandmas kept around for a day where other dishes would leave at least someone unsatisfied at the table. The Shakers were a group that believed in Christ rather deeply, and they came from England to the United States, where they made rotos in Ohio, Kentucky, and New England. They were pretty famous for their devotion to the bit, but they had a reputation that preceded that too. It was their practical cooking which really made heads turn, because it was all based on local ingredients that anyone could find on a budget, and the goal was to waste as little as possible. They had these communal kitchens and they used to share meals, so a lot of their recipes were things you could produce in a batch and easily make for an entire large group. One of those was the lemon shaker pie, which was one of the best imports of the US. If you were at a Shaker residence, then you'd always find a pantry stocked full of lemons because they got a lot of use out of this pie. The crust is simple, minimal, and straight to the point. There are no fancy decorations or unnecessary flashy ingredients in this pie. It's a down-to-earth pie that uses the entire lemon, including the peel. They mix the sliced lemons with sugar and leave it to macerate for many hours, which gives a flavor that you otherwise just can't get. I have to hand it to them. They really did excel in making full use of every part of a pie. Speaking of frugal cooking, dial it back to the Great Depression for a second with me. I'm talking about the heart of the crisis right in the 1930s and maybe the start of the early 40s. Crackers are more in style than ever before, and it's the breakfast of many people, as it's a pretty cheap way to keep that appetite in check and those finances safe. Still, humans are humans, and cravings are something that gets all of us really badly. What do? People made up things like the soda cracker pie. It took these crushed saltine crackers and mixed them with basic pie ingredients to get a really firm meringue-like crust, which was then filled with fresh fruit and whipped cream. Strawberries and bananas were still available in that time, and people would even barter them in exchange for basic clothes or tools, so a family could get around to enjoy this every once in a while. The history of egg custard pies is as rich as the filling, so settle in while we unravel all this delicious baked treat has to offer. As is common with most things in America, it came from outside the country and got adopted by our great-grandparents into something that was fit for everyday home use. This time, we have the English and Dutch to thank because egg custard pies weren't a thing here, but over there, they had already been a well-established part of the cooking culture. A basic custard pie just takes eggs and milk and makes a filling out of that. The pie crust isn't anything too out of the ordinary either. It's a pretty tame dish, all things considered. Cookbooks in the 19th century in America, like the Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph, first started including different versions of the egg custard pie, like including a thickener or using cinnamon and nutmeg. It became really popular in the South, more than anywhere else. This is something you'll hear a lot of throughout the video, because a good pie is always appreciated twice as much more down in the South. It also kind of had the competition beat in the price department. You just need eggs and milk to make this? And a pastry crust you can buy at any store around the block? That's a steal. Soon, the custard pie started getting so popular that it introduced new dishes entirely like the chess and buttermilk pies we went over a while ago. Cushaw pie with vanilla bean custard sauce. This definitely is one I hadn't heard about ever, and I'd be surprised if you did. At first, it was like, what is a Cushaw pie? I honestly thought it was going to be some kind of dry, fruit-based pie topped with pecans. In reality, though, what you get here is a lot more similar to pumpkin pie. It makes use of cushaw, which is a winter squash, and is known for its hardiness. It's also completely native to North America, so early American settlers loved making this dish when they took it from Native American culture, which had already been pre-established in the area. Cushaw pie was a really common thing for the natives to make, as it made use of local agriculture and basic ingredients to give a sweet dessert. Spices, nutmeg, and cinnamon were the B team here that gave this dish its flavor and identity. Though you really needed to be careful about the mix, because too much of either of them would set the whole thing off. Then there's that delicious vanilla bean custard sauce. It's sad this dish isn't remembered because not a lot of things use vanilla bean custard sauces anymore, but it seems like such a good concept. That's my take anyway. What about you? Would you try to recreate this? Toffee apple pies with dulce de leche are a lot more modern in comparison. Though these chefs took an interest in Argentinian culture, which makes a lot of use of dulce de leche so that the flavor and texture of a pie can be enhanced. It was seen as a fusion dessert by the global community because it took Latin and British influences and mixed them in one dish. In America, it got popular because it made a lot of use of spiced apples and caramelized milk spreads. Caramel was a flavor that America already deeply admired. Spiced apples were a very old-school American snack, so it's no wonder this dish took off as well as it did. You usually don't associate cocktails with your pies, right? But to understand this one, we really need to look at one of Giuseppe Cipriani, a legendary bar owner and drink maker, Bellini cocktail. He made this in 1948 and named it after a Venetian Renaissance painter because the drink had an unusually pale color that was really similar to some of the painter's early works. The cocktail did insanely well, probably even far beyond what Giuseppe expected it to do. Even in the US, before and after the Prohibition, this was one of the most famous drinks you could get. The pie was something that happened as a part of a trend that took place during the late 20th century, around when the curtains were closing on the infamous 1900s. People were really into trying all kinds of fusion food, and they decided to incorporate cocktail flavors into pies to try and see the outcome. In a mad scientist-esque food experiment, they took a peach filling and sweetened it to the high heavens with Prosecco, or sparkling wines, and some even introduced peach liqueur into the mix to really give it that Bellini feel. It was meant to imitate the bubbly and peachy nature of the Bellini cocktail itself, which was a sweet drink that would put you in the mood for a couple more rounds. They did a pretty okay job of it, since nobody ate this without asking for seconds either. Yellow peaches were usually used, but any kind worked. It was honestly a lot easier to mess this up, but somehow people found a way for a pie to actually imitate a premium cocktail. A peach pie named and shaped after a luxury cocktail might be a little too rich for your blood or mine, at least on a weekly basis. So why not take a turn and look at some rustic cooking? Namely, a variation of apple pies known as apple and ginger stab pies. These are not so well known in the American cooking sphere, but they have some pretty strong roots in the culture. It was a common recipe in colonial America. The way this pie got its name is due to the method cooks used to check the temperature in those times. They didn't have any kind of oven or thermostat to work with, so they had to stab pies with forks to let steam escape and see if the pie was properly baked. The method was something that was common in every kind of pie, and if you didn't do it, you would end up with a soggy mess because of all the trapped steam. This was a really practical, pragmatic pie that got the job done for your immediate needs. Apple pies were already a really firm concept in American cooking, and ginger as a spice first became popular through the trade routes Americans had with Southeast Asia. They mixed both of these together in the 18th century, and people genuinely loved what they got, enough to adopt it into their everyday and weekly cooking, and this dish was really in its element back then. If we take a more modern look, we can see that it has massive fan bases in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, but it gets more traction across the nation overall during the fall and winter when apples are in plentiful harvest. Plus, people really love the warmth of ginger when it starts getting cold. It's one of the nicest and simplest heritage recipes you can find out there. Flapper pie is the last one on our list. I have to say, it's been really interesting exploring all these different pies together, since there's a lot more innovation here than most people would really think of. I mean, maybe a fancy meringue, sure, but things like Bellini peach pies, vanilla bean custard sauces. The flapper pie continues that trend, but not in the way you think. See, for those dishes, their unique and premium tastes feel really on brand because of the technical aspects involved in the cooking and the use of fine ingredients. For desserts like the flapper pie, which just make sure of graham crackers, cornstarch, milk, eggs, and sugar, you would expect a lot more of a homely vibe and flavor out of this dish. A cozy and calm ride that doesn't really do a lot of new things, but does simple and old ones really well. That's not what it is at all. The flapper pie came as a result of Canadian prairie kitchens, where this dish was commonly made. They had little access to any kind of fresh pie-making ingredients back then, but what they could do is make full use of what they had. That had to be things that were available in every prairie household, and graham crackers fit the bill down to a T. Ah! Now do you see why we say, you can never go wrong with a good pie? Like and subscribe for more nostalgic content.